or still as part of that introductory phase of also making sure that you're correctly administering all the different capabilities of the Microsoft Teams platform, from policies to managing apps, in contact with follow-up questions or some of the latest announcements that we have. And of course, also make sure to follow the @Microsoft Teams to get, again, all of the latest updates. Now, for the purposes of the webinar that we have together today, this is where you'll see we're covering a few key things. First one is to introduce how do we enable Teams and an introduction to the product for those who might be, again, new to Teams itself. Then I'll be focusing around the Teams lifecycle and discussing strategies to make sure that your users can create Teams and it's frictionless, while making sure we meet your business rules and particularly addressing IT governance. And we're also going to be covering then the security and compliance capabilities of Teams, because it is part of Office 365 and really leverages the existing tools that you have today. Now, I'm going to encourage everyone right now to open up a new browser tab, and as part of that to type in the address that you see here on the screen, aka.ms/Teams edu IT Pro resources. So open up that new browser tab and type in the address aka.ms/Teams edu IT Pro resources. This is going to take you to a presentation pack which will have a lot of the links, documents, and pretty much everything that you need to make sure that you can follow along with the resources from today. Now, I'll also encourage everyone to please make sure that you take advantage of then the live chat. So the chat space here in the webinar allows you to then ask questions and our team will respond to you. So please make sure that you take advantage of those capabilities and really make sure that you get your questions answered while you're listening at any point throughout today. Now, let's begin. For those who are very much early in their Microsoft Teams journey, this is where, of course, the key first step is to make sure you enable Microsoft Teams so your users and yourselves can get access to it. Now, we have detailed documentation available for you online. So if you head on over to the Microsoft Docs website, there is a quick start guide for Teams for Education. So just search Teams for Education Quick Start Guide for Admins, or visit the direct URL there on the website, or I should say on the screen, and that'll take you through the key steps to getting Teams enabled. The key part here is making sure that you assign the Microsoft Teams license to your users, and then once that you've assigned the license, that's how you'll be able to then access Teams. Now, a key part to, of course, accessing Teams is how do we then, for yourselves as administrators, access and take advantage of the Admin Center. Now, the Admin Center is available as part of admin.teams.microsoft.com, but what I'm going to do now is show you how we actually can get there directly from the Office home page. All right, so you'll see here that right now I'm just at office.com. And I'm going to head on over to the admin tile. When I click on the admin tile, that'll take me straight over to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So this is where you can assign your users, your licenses. And of course, if you are managing a lot of users, we would recommend that you automate that process of license assignment, for example, with PowerShell. But when I scroll on down, you can see here my admin centers, and I can click on Microsoft Teams. That then takes me straight across to the admin.teams.microsoft.com. And now this is really everything that I need to administer Microsoft Teams for my organization. You'll see here on the left-hand side are all of the different capabilities that the Admin Center provides. But what I'm going to encourage is for people who are first time or very early in their rollout and planning their deployment of Microsoft Teams, head to the appropriately named Planning tab. You'll see here we have a Teams Advisor. Now, I've already clicked Create, so when you first go here, you'll need to click the Create button. But what this does is it'll actually create a team for you in Microsoft Teams with all of the resources and steps and project plans to enable Teams. So this is really a tool that you can use with your colleagues as part of the project rollout. So you can see here, I've already added the chat, teams, and channels workload, and this then gives me, you can see here, all of the resources that I need to deploy those things. What does this actually do? Well, you'll see if I head on over to the Microsoft Teams app itself, this is where you can see I've actually now been automatically added into the deployment team. And this is where we have then a place with my colleagues again within IT who are administering the rollout of Teams. You'll see here we've got a bot that can help you as part of the actual team setup. But most important, if I click on the chat, Teams, channels, and apps, you'll see here I have a planner. Now this planner is invaluable for anyone who is running a project to fully enable Teams for your colleagues. If I just zoom out a little bit, you can see here this now has then all of the steps that we need, from getting ready to rolling out to our early adopters to planning our org-wide rollout. And you'll see here, for example, that if I scroll on down to, let's say, turn on Teams for pilot users, you can see all of the information that we need is available. So if I go over and do something like, let's say, get your help desk ready to support Teams, inside of here are all of the documents that I need, so to review, for example, the help desk support, and we also have all of the direct links, so things like managing the different roles, known issues for Teams, troubleshooting connectivity issues. You'll see here if we go over to, for example, roll out Teams to our pilot users or monitoring usage and feedback, again, everything that we need is all available from one single place. So this is a real best practice that I would strongly recommend anyone on the webinar right now that is in that early phase of still configuring and deploying Teams to then take advantage of the planning tab and the Teams advisor. And you can see here, I'm also now going to add in a new workload, and I'm now going to also add in part of a channel that we can then talk around the meetings and conferencing. You'll see here when I click create, what this will actually do is then add in that next wave of tasks and actions to use as part of my deployment team. So this is just something, it's optional, but it's extremely helpful for anyone who is still in that early phase of enabling Teams for their users. And this is really going to give you everything that you need. And you can see when I head back over to Teams, that has now updated my deployment team, again for meetings and conferencing, with a planner now filled with all of the key tasks that I need to be able to then plan out and deploy the conferencing and online meetings capabilities of Teams. So very, very powerful and very, very useful. Now I'm going to head back up to the dashboard, because this is where I'm going to come back to the slides. Now that we're back in the slides, so just remember the deployment team is optional, but it's a fantastic resource to have a structured project plan with your colleagues who are administering Teams. And then of course to get started by clicking on that start button or heading over to the planning tab on the left hand side. Okay, so you've now got Teams has been enabled for yourself, and you're going through and thinking about how do we enable that and configure it for all of our users. And that's where I just wanted to take a quick moment to provide a quick overview of Microsoft Teams and the key concepts and how we're seeing it being used today. Because of course, changing policies for the sake of it is not a good idea. You should always have business intent around any policies that you configure. Because at the end of the day, we want to keep Teams as a powerful, flexible collaboration and communication hub that empowers our users. And this is a really key theme here, which is this idea of Microsoft Teams as a concept. It is the one hub where everyone is connected. Teams fundamentally can bring learners together in teaching and learning classrooms. It allows faculty and staff to collaborate and coordinate with one another. Teams can be set up to do things like professional development communities. And of course, also when we think about Teams, it's not just for staff, but how do we also give our students a safe, secure set of tools that they can use to build communities, that they can communicate with one another, but also giving them a place where they can collaborate and develop job-ready skills that will then take them into the workforce and allow them to be successful in their first careers after they finish their time in education. And this is where we also then see Teams being used as a powerful, secure tool for research collaboration and also apprenticeships by taking advantage of the external and guest access capabilities that allow you to bring other people into a team. Very, very powerful. So this concept, this is fundamentally, it's when we create a team, it's how we collaborate and communicate together that defines the scenario in which we use it. But really, when you start to think about then how does that actually map to the different capabilities of Teams? First, And foremost, when I talk about Teams, it's that hub for communication and collaboration. So from a communications point of view, Microsoft Teams is the successor to Skype for Business. So fundamentally, it is using brand new infrastructure, which allows it to do things that Skype for Business could never do in terms of having fantastic online, real-time, high-definition meetings with taking advantage of things like the latest web real-time communication technologies, allowing for high-definition audio and video, doing things like background blur, real-time captions. It is all in all a fundamentally much better and an amazing online meeting and also conferencing and calling experience. So this allows you to then be able to do telephony calls. It allows us to have real-time chat, online meetings. And then the difference between Teams is it's not just a place for communication, but also allowing us to be able to collaborate together. And so this is where you see deep integration with the Office 365 products. This means we can work together in real time on documents. We don't need to worry about sending each other links. Because we're part of the team, we have access to work together on the documents in that team securely and seamlessly. We can also people are then clear on what we're doing when and plan out activities. Integrate things like Microsoft Stream, a powerful online video platform that's also extremely powerful for things like lecture capture and on-demand video, and other parts of the Office 365 product suite, Power BI, Microsoft Forms for quizzes. But the big we also then have deep integrations with then the third-party apps. So there are hundreds of apps available. Quizlet, hundreds of integrations that allow you to then extend the Teams capability to bring in third-party applications, but still a singular hub where everyone is connected. And then the last part is fundamentally Teams is then designed and enhanced for education, where we have made unique capabilities for educators and universities, schools, and colleges to have things like the class team type, which give you access to an assignment service, the OneNote class notebook. And so this is where I wanted to show a quick example of what this looks like when we bring it all together. And this is an example of how University of Texas at Arlington are experiencing this idea of one hub where everyone is connected across scenarios.
Also serve students that are in age, and also in terms of abilities. For us,
for Teams, we were using Zoom, Slack, email, Jabber. Right, like that.
You have to think about how do we make.
We had so much change at UTA on the technology front. There was this concern there'd be
each other. The video portion and the video conference is everything is in one place.
Teams fully integrated in with, and we can find the file that we have been working on, and we can even collaborate as a group.
My information is in of service. How do we intend to use Teams for the future? It's just going to
in future plans for the campus much more efficiently.
Now, the next key concept, as you heard me referring to a moment ago, is how Microsoft Teams then is enabling customers to collaborate, but then also integrate third-party solutions. And so this is where we have the App Store available in Microsoft Teams, which allows you to bring in third-party apps. And what these apps are, think about it in concept like the apps on your smartphone. This is then a store that is secure and reviewed by Microsoft for all submissions before they are made public. But once they meet minimum content standards, and of course that they are secure from a code point of view, how that data is then being managed. So this is where you can see here Adobe Creative Cloud as a great example. Most people know, of course, you need an Adobe subscription to use their services, and at that point it's up to you and the agreement that you have with Adobe. What we're providing here is integrations so you can work together directly in the context of Teams and bring in not just Microsoft products but other third-party products into a singular hub. Now, absolutely, we've heard feedback that is being used within those services, and this is where, if you search for the Microsoft Teams apps security and compliance, we have then public documentation which goes through all of the applications are part of the Cloud Security Alliance information. And so this is where we have a series of a lot of detail available to make sure that you can then view that app developer to make sure you get the information that you need. And every single app always has a privacy policy. But the key point here is to think about Teams then as this ecosystem that is bringing together all of your investments, not just into Microsoft, but also into other applications. And a key part, of course, of thinking about then modern Microsoft is also this idea that it is a consistent and fantastic experience. Windows, Linux, or Apple MacBook, we have then an app available for you that is then fully installed and on Windows devices, Apple devices, and we listen to a lot of feedback, and then we've also made available the Linux client. We have then Teams available on tablet devices, on phones, and then also in the browser, so you can access Teams without make sure that you do install the Teams app to get the full capabilities on your device and on your platform. So that's a bit of an overview then of Teams. And now when we really start to think about the Teams lifecycle, this is where I wanted to go through thinking about then the three key stages. From initiating, now that could be an example of a project team, that could be the example of a class team, but there is always a beginning to that team, the period of time where the team is active, and then at some point the team will be eventually concluded, again, for example, at the end of semester as part of a course or at the end of a project. Now you can have ongoing teams, that's absolutely, for example, a staff team, but a lot of teams will typically have a start, in progress, and then a conclusion to them. But you can, of course, have teams that last indefinitely across many, many years, or as long as you choose to use them for. Now, the key part here is that we then manage the policy as part of that initiation phase. Now, the key concept that I want everyone to be aware of is that when we now have Teams enabled, from the license point of view, how do we configure the policies? So the core concept is that we create policies and then assign them per user. So per user is the key way to think about this. You're creating the policies and then assigning that across the users in your organization. And it's up to you how you then assign those licenses. For example, you might assign a policy for students and a different policy to teachers and educators and staff members. It is your choice, but this is where I want to take you through the Teams interface so we can see what that looks like. So back in then the admin portal for Teams, you'll see here along the left-hand side are the key parts that we need. But because we're still during the initiate phase, what I'm going to do, now you can see here, the way that it works is, as I mentioned before, we create the policy, then we assign that to our users. Now you'll see here, if I go over to meetings, for example, we can click on meetings policy, and then you will see a series of policies that have been created. Now, as the name suggests, global org-wide default is then by default applied to your users. And then what you would do is, if you want to have different policies applied to different users, you would then, for example, assign maybe the kiosk policy to a subgroup of users who maybe are focused on kiosk type work or require that policy. Now, to create a policy, it's very, very simple. We simply click on add, and of course we can then edit existing policies. Now you can see here, very straightforward. To be able to edit the policy, I can simply go through and then on or off for the different capabilities. So a great one would be, of course, we want to allow transcription because we want people to working, and then just like that, I can go through and we can select all of the capabilities that we want on or off as part of, right now, the Teams meeting policy. Simply click Save, and just like that, this fourth thing to keep in mind here, as a rule of best practice, is to, for whatever policies that you want to apply to the greatest number of users, edit and update, for example, the org-wide default, and then for smaller groups of users to then apply that as part of a new policy. So an example of that would be, let's say right now we want all of our students to have the ability to have, for example, that transcription enabled. Therefore, I'm going to update the global settings, and because a smaller group of users are my teachers, you will normally always have less teachers than students, that's where we might add a different policy and then go ahead and apply that to our teachers. Let me give you a few more examples and it'll all come together, because once you're used to it, it is very, very approachable. So you've seen here the meetings. If I go over to the messaging policy, for example, again, this is where I can create new policies or, of course, edit existing ones. So if I go over to, in this example here, my org-wide default, this is where I can then turn on and off all of the different capabilities. So we can see here there's a tremendous amount of rich capabilities that Teams has. One of the most powerful things is we do have then Giphies when we think about creating more interesting and engaging conversations. And by default, we can then make sure that they are moderate, strict, and again appropriate for the type of content that appears for our users. Just a tip, but it's also very, very powerful. You can see here a great one that I would always recommend is, of course, translating messages. Very useful for if you have people who are studying with you or working with you that might be in their second language as part of work. Again, we can then have those ability for people to translate a message. And so this is very powerful, again, that you can then choose on or off for the different capabilities. So this is really where you have now this ability to then create lots of different policies and then assign those per user. So you might be saying, well, let me see exactly how that all comes together. And I'll do that now with the app permission policies. You can see here a common one that people say is, well, what about then if I want to have an app that maybe we don't want to allow our users to have access to? So this is here where we can create a new policy. We can give it a name, and then I can allow or not allow certain apps to be made available to my users. So you can see here, here's one I've made earlier called blocked apps. And as part of the blocked apps, you can see what this does is for some of the Microsoft apps, in this example, weather and power apps, we then allow others, but not these specific apps. And so, for example, if I want to, again, you can see here, I can then click block. And again, this is now going to be an app that my users will not have access to. Something very important to keep in mind, of course, is the most successful schools, universities, and colleges do allow the full capabilities of Teams. The more you restrict apps and access to this, the more you are encouraging your users to use third-party solutions as part of Shadow IT and not in a framework that you can support. But if you do have business requirements where you do need to block a certain app, this is how you are able to do that. So you can see here, we now have the weather, power apps, and places that have been are part of the blocked app list. I click on Save. And now what I can go and do is apply this to my users. Now, of course, I'm going to show you just how I would do it in a very quick example. this policy should apply to. So in this example, I can now see all of my users, and I'm going to go to Cara Coleman, and you can see here that, remember, we created the blocked app policy, and now we apply that policy to the user per app policy. You can see here, when I go over and click on policies, I can see all of the apps, I should say all of the policies that have been applied to Cara. And so you'll see that right now, she's actually not got the org-wide default. She has the block in the org-wide default. And this is where I can very quickly do this for individual users. Of course, when you are doing this for large numbers of students or large numbers of teachers, you would want to write a script that automatically is applying this. But just as this is how we can quickly and easily do this for one-off users. Now you'll see here that Cara has been given admin user, and you can see here. And again, the App Store is incredibly powerful. This is where we have hundreds of integrations from providers and well-known developers around the world that give a lot of value. So again, you should always enable and leave enabled as many of the apps as possible. A lot of educational apps that are available, from plagiarism checkers and beyond, so very, very powerful. But in this example, remember, one of the blocked apps was weather. Now I'm currently the admin who does not have that policy applied. So you can see here, I can search the store and weather is there available for me. Now by comparison, if I just quickly switch browsers and go over to Cara, you'll see here, by comparison, you'll notice it does not. She does not have weather appearing here. Now this concept is exactly the same as we just saw meetings, and exactly the same as we just saw the messaging policy, that, for example, that would update. It can take a few hours for the policies to apply to the user, but this is where, for example, if we wanted to block the ability for Cara to do online meetings, this is where it would. So very, very powerful, and a very, very important concept is this idea that Teams, we create the policy and then we apply it per user. Now you'll see here, we can quickly see what policies have been applied, and we also policies that a user can have. What a policy package does is it wraps up all of those different policies by the higher education student package that then automatically will update the messaging policy, the meeting policy, the app setup policy, calling policy, and live events. This is just a way that you can save a bit. You can go through and create your own policies, and then you apply that per user. And again, for lots of users, you would automate that. You wouldn't manually go through and click per user and update the policies that way. But just to show you a quick practical example of how, for example, you can then do per app. Another really powerful one that I do So what app setup policies allow you to do is then also customize the Microsoft Teams interface. Now this the navigation bar on the left-hand side and also on mobile. So you'll notice here right now we have activity well. But what about if I wanted to have Planner be pinned on the left-hand side, because right now I want all of my staff members to easily access Planner. As one example, again, this could be any of the apps that are pinnable. We're going to then create a new policy called planner for staff. And what this is simply going to do is it's going to the apps that are available. But if I click on add apps, you can see what I can do is now go through and then search for, in this example, planner, which is a great app to organize then plans and tasks, and click add. Now you'll see here I can then also change and then click save. Now this is very, very powerful, because think about, you might want to have your own custom app that might be landing on a web resource or a SharePoint site. This could be then the university hub or a school welcome page. You can now customize the Teams navigation bar to then have your own applications appear there if you make them for interest of time of what that looks like. In the interest of time, here's what that looks like, because of course what we would need to do is go and apply this policy to a user, and then it would take a few hours for it to update. But you can see what I've done is I've already pre-applied the policy to a similar user, which I've just already made. Is directly below chat. So this is where we have app setup policy that allows you to be able to go through and then, for example, reorganize and reorder then the apps. So a fantastic way where maybe you might want to have project management apps pinned on the left-hand side for staff members who are then focused on projects, but you might not apply that to educators and teachers, because they might have educational apps pinned there like OneNote. But the key takeaway message here is that you can then set up and customize the. So let's head back over to the slides, because there are a few other key pieces of info. So you can see here the assignments tab as part of a class team, very powerful. I would definitely recommend to make sure you enable the make code add-in, which allows really valuable for coding subjects, allows you to integrate then the make code block-based coding language. For those who want to integrate the plagiarism checking of Turnitin, again, if you have a Turnitin membership, or I should say subscription, the guardians who are then supporting students when they're at home, you can also organize and create an email digest which sends an automated summary of then the student's progress. And so all of that can be administered from the assignments area. So now let's head back over to the slides. So back to the slides, there's a quick example of what it looks like to then do the app setup policy, where you can have full control both on desktop and then also compatible apps. Now is we've made sure we have the correct policies in place, so when users are working together in those teams, that they are then able to use and work together in ways that are appropriate to your organization. But let's talk a little bit about then the team creation itself. You can see here then you have the ability to control who can create a team. Now what it looks like is when we go over and click join or create a team, you'll see here the create team button. Now this is if you have the permissions to create an Office 365 group enabled, your users will be able to come over and click create a team. Your teachers, your educators, your staff members to be able to create their own teams as required. And the opposite example then is if you disable group creation, it means educators cannot option. And so this is why it's so important to allow educators to be able to create teams, otherwise they will not then have a clear way to know how to actually engage in the process. And if you have manual request processes, you end up burning a lot of time on manual processes when this for you to be able to then create and allow your users to self-create teams, while also then making sure you have governance and automation to meet your needs rather than having manual request processes. So also you might be saying, well, you mentioned educators and staff. What about students? So students in further and higher education, so of course over the age of 18, should also be able to self-create teams. This is an student communities, being part then of the academic space, and then also learning things like project management, group collaboration skills. This is where, of course, it's a different conversation for younger students who are in school, for example, under the age of 18, but both staff and students should be able to self-create teams in higher and further education. And of course, there are many circumstances disable team creation should you deem it necessary. But the most successful organizations do allow teams self-creation. Now you might be saying, well, I'd like to let my students self-create teams, but what happens if they use, for example, language which we do not allow in the team name? Now this is what I meant before about you have the ability to automate team creation. So what you're seeing here is an example where a team then has been applied with naming policy. So you can see here it automatically then applies the naming convention. So for example, it can apply the department name, or alternatively, it can apply things either a prefix or a suffix, which then might be, for example, a TU for student, or again, words or letters of your choice. You can see here, notification of a blocked word in the team name. What this means is we can then block custom language, so whether it's bad language or alternatively even names that you don't deem appropriate. For in this example, financial. Therefore, no student could create a team called financial aid. And this is where we also have the ability to start to do things like have, for example, the organizational guidelines. So of course, out of the box, you do need to enable naming policy and enable organizational guidelines for these to then appear. But this is where it's so important to be aware of these policies, because this is how we can then see colleges and universities allow students to create teams that have appropriate names, that meet your organizational guidelines, that follow a naming convention, and importantly are doing this automatically. So it's not creating extra workload for IT, and it's allowing your staff and students the best experience to be able to use the tool effectively together. You'll also you've not seen the classification option. Again, this will only appear if you've set up classification labels. But in this example here, you can define those labels. And so we can see here we have then the name of highly confidential, confidential, or general use. And so again, this is defined by you as the administrator, but all of these policies are publicly available. So if you simply search for policy names like naming policy, Office 365 group classification, organizational guidelines, and I'll show you where some of this is in just a moment. This is again easily accessible, and once you configure it, very customizable to give us governance, security, while also empowering our users. And so this is important as we think about the user experience while also meeting then our needs from a governance and management point of view. So when you notice that a team, when you click create a team, now for a student, they do not get to pick the team type. They by default have the generic team type. But for staff members in education, this is where we have team templates. And so you'll notice you actually have a choice to make between 4 template options: class, professional learning community, staff, and other. The core concept here is this is just a template. It has a few unique characteristics, and then beyond that, it's still a team. The team itself overall is an Office 365 group, and then it's fundamentally how that team is being used depends on the scenario. So the obvious example is if you're creating a class team for a teaching scenario, unique to that type of team is a OneNote class notebook. It has the assignment service, it has the grade book, it has class insights for additional analytics. It gives you the ability to list by default. By comparison, if you create a PLC team, then of course it doesn't have the assignments or the gradebook, because now this is us as colleagues working together as educators or staff members. So this is where it has a OneNote PLC notebook type. If it's a staff team, this is designed particularly within school districts where we have the OneNote staff notebook, and then the other team type is really best for all other scenarios. It is then the least templated, and it has then the conversation space, the file space, and it's fully customizable. You could add in OneNote, you could add in any of the hundreds of other apps, and it's the most flexible. So really, if you're in doubt, if you're looking to do a project, for example, or a research initiative, other is the best in all other scenarios if you don't have an explicit need for, say, the class team or the staff notebook. Now, this is just an important part here when we think about those different team types. We've also then configured so we have things like naming policy to allow our users to be able to self-create teams, but again with appropriate names that conform to our naming policy. What about now during the active phase of the teams? So this is where you can see here, if I go over to the admin center, I can see all of the teams that are available inside of my environment. This is where I can go through and I can see by clicking on the Teams tab, GUI interface that you can simply click on Teams. You can see all of the teams in your environment. If you choose to, you can then even click on the team, see the members. You can also manage the members, promote someone to an owner if you need to. You can see the channels and the settings. Saying, well, look, we have people actively using Teams, but what about then? It's one thing to see the members, but I need to make sure that the files and the information in those teams uses then the data retention policies that you set up for Exchange and SharePoint to then make sure that that information is being retained as per your policy. So this is where you need to go to the Security and Compliance Admin Center. But the key concept here is fundamentally the core parts of Microsoft Teams is then the Exchange mailbox that gets associated and stores all chat content. And again, if someone deletes a file, this is also where it's using SharePoint. You have file version history, and again, you have all of the auditing and file. While Teams looks like a new interface, this is sitting on top of existing architecture of Exchange and SharePoint, which means you have archiving, retention policies, and audit logs. You have those capabilities, and this is all then for Exchange and SharePoint. So you can see here, if we go over to the audit logs, I can go through and I can see capabilities, for example, things like data loss prevention policies, say credit card numbers or other personal information that you choose to define. The project is finished, the research initiative has concluded, and now we need to sunset the team. Well, this is where we can see here what happens during that final phase. Of teams. So this is again how you can enable staff teams. You don't need to worry about sprawl and having to then manually go through and review teams over time. What you have is the ability to automate the life cycle with the group expiration. That means after a period of time that you define, it could be 180 days, it could be 1 year, 2 years, again, the period of time that you place as part of the policy. It allows you then to, again, will then stay for that period of time, but if it is no longer active, so again, for example, someone's made a test team, it will then automatically be removed from your environment. Explore how to use the team. You're empowering them to be able to create teams as they require it. But as those teams then process for you. And teams can now also detect activity-based renewals. So this is where, again, it's very, very powerful. And you also have the ability where it says email contact for groups with no owners. Again, you could have an email inbox for your IT help desk, so in case they've maybe moved on from the organization. So what does that look like? Well, you can see here the renewal experience, very, very straightforward. Activity based, if it detects activity, it will renew. Or if there is no detected activity, it will then send out a notification. It will send multiple emails getting closer to then the expiration date, as well as also you will clearly see it from the team to then allow the users to choose to learning and you are new to the product, and now you're ready for it to allow it to be restore the group. And remember, this is then just using Office 365 groups. So SharePoint, and behind the scenes, whatever file retention you apply will then be applied to this. So even though the team might be marked for deletion, if you then have a file retention policy for, let's say, 3 years, those files now quickly to the Azure admin portal. We're not talking about Microsoft Teams policies because, as I mentioned, we are now using Office groups, and Office groups are part of Azure Active Directory. And this is where we can see very easily, I can set up my expiration policy, I can set up my naming policy, and this is where keywords like financial you don't want to allow. And then this is also where we can make sure we have consistent naming. So for example, any team that's created, I can then set it so students, for example, it'll automatically append a suffix of STU because I want it to say student at the end of any student created team. And again, this is all available if you simply search for things like Office 365. Now maybe point of reference. So extremely helpful as we think about students going from say level 1 to level 2 of mathematics. Again, this is where I now have the ability to archive a team project, and you still want to have reference to the decisions that were made. Or again, if I'm a student and I want to be able to view the documents, but we want to make sure there's no additional changes, we can archive that team, which switches it to read only, but still makes it available for users to see. Seen our teams have been created, they've been actively used, and then they've come through and they're being marked for their sunset phase to be completed. But how do we actually track all of the usage in Teams itself? Well, this is where you have the ability from analytics and reports inside of the admin center of usage across your teams. You can see how it's being used across devices, and you can see that then for up to the last 28 days. So as a best practice, a piece of advice, you export this data, so that way it's then available, and then you can store that over time for as long as you want. But this is where we can then see the usage across our environment, and also very, very important if you are wanting to track. Now, what we saw before was, of course, students in higher education who are over the age of 18, where appropriate, should be able to self-create teams, and staff members should also be able to self-create teams. But what about then in scenarios where does that mean everyone should manually have to create teams, particularly if we're thinking about large staff departments or class teams? No. can automate things like the class creations by using free services like School Data Sync. So if you just search for School Data Sync, this allows you to then be able to create teams that sync with your student information system. It'll add in the teacher, the students, and it'll automatically keep that class roster up to date. And as part of keeping that class, then if you want to create your own automation for things like staff teams, or you want to have additional customization capabilities, this is where you'll see here that we then have automate the process of team creation and lifecycle management. And more powerfully is the Microsoft Graph, which allows me to then automate and manage the entire lifecycle, and then also archiving and sunsetting the team. This is a quick overview of the different capabilities, but as a rule of thumb, the capabilities of PowerShell are only a subset of what you can do with the Microsoft Graph. The Graph gives you full capabilities of all of what suggests that you invest time to start bringing the Graph into your automation practices, because you can see here on the right hand side that the Graph allows you to do from a single set of API calls almost the entire of that life cycle, from creation, adding members, configuring settings, adding channels, installing apps, adding tabs, archiving and deleting. All of this can then be automated through the Microsoft Graph. So very, very powerful. And to get started, simply search Microsoft Graph. I'll leave you now with a few resources to wrap up the session that we've had today. Now, of course, to begin, simply start is always the best way. So get started using Teams, and this will allow you then to be able to really experience and then plan your rollout. You saw before, for those who are starting to say, well, there was quite a few topics that we went, and I'd like to see additional advanced sessions for both IT as well as also for staff members. And remember, if you visit the aka.ms/teams edu IT Pro resources, this is then a summary of all of the publicly available Microsoft documentation. So it just brings it together into a singular place. But of course, you can search for anything that you've seen: naming policy, expiration policy, setting up of teams, and then all of this documentation is publicly available for you. Thank everyone for their time. And when the webinar finishes, there will be a quick survey just to give some feedback. We would really appreciate it to take just a few moments to fill in what you enjoyed and what you'd like to see covered in the future. And thank you again, everyone. I hope this helps you now with your introduction to Microsoft Teams for IT pros and administration. Have a great rest of your day.